This story is based on real events that happened very recently. An ordinary driver noticed something strange on an empty night highway. A tiny silhouette slowly moving in the fog. One glance into the darkness changed everything. But was he the only one watching from the shadows that night? The night crept over the land slowly, like the cold breath of a late autumn. The fog lay heavy and thick over the road, swallowing the headlights' glow, blending it into a murky watercolor. The Northwestern Turnpike was empty. No cars, no people. Only the distant, barely visible silhouettes of trees swayed in the night, like shadows whispering to each other in the wind. Bradley gripped the steering wheel tightly, unconsciously pressing his fingers into the leather. He was used to these night drives. The roads were deserted and the silence stretched, turning reality into something fragile, as if he were traveling through a forgotten part of the world, a place where time had stopped. Only the quiet crackling of the radio reminded him that the world still existed. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Something flickered on the roadside, and Bradley's heart plummeted, too low to the asphalt, too big for a cat. For a moment his mind scrambled for an explanation. A dog, a fox. But deep inside he already knew it was something else. He jerked the wheel instinctively, and only at the last second realized it was a child. A tiny figure crawling slowly across the road. Bradley slammed the brakes. The car screeched like a wounded animal fighting for its life. He burst out of the vehicle, the cold air slapping his face, stinging his cheeks, as if reality itself was punching him, forcing him to comprehend what he was seeing. On the asphalt, inching forward in a slow, desperate crawl, was a little girl. She looked no older than a year, dressed in a thin pajama. Her bare feet touched the freezing ground. Bradley rushed toward her but froze. She wasn't crying, wasn't calling for help. She just crawled, as if she had no choice, as if something was forcing her to move forward into the darkness. He bent down, his fingers brushing against her delicate shoulder. Ice. Not skin, not warm human flesh, but a piece of winter itself, alive but defenseless. She shivered but didn't recoil, didn't cry. She only looked up at him with huge, endlessly dark eyes where the headlights' glow reflected like tiny moons. "It's okay," Bradley's voice came out too sharp. He swallowed, trying to soften his tone. "You're not alone." He scooped her into his arms and a chilling sensation shot through him, as if an icy needle had pierced straight through his chest. She was weightless, as if time had drained the life from her, leaving only a fragile shell with the faintest ember of warmth inside. Bradley pressed her against his chest, wrapping her in the warmth of his jacket, and ran back to the car. Slamming the door shut, he placed her in the passenger seat, his trembling fingers cranking the heat to full blast. Warm air rushed out, hitting his face, but the girl didn't move. She just shivered, curled into a tiny ball. It's okay," he muttered, covering her small hands with his own, trying to transfer his warmth to her. His phone slipped from his pocket. He grabbed it, not taking his eyes off the girl, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "Hello? I found a child on the road. A little girl. She's barefoot, in pajamas. She's freezing. There was no one around her." The voice on the other end said something, but he barely heard it. His mind echoed with a single thought. "Do something." "Yes, Northwestern Turnpike, near the junction. Yes, I'm waiting." He wanted to say something to her, but what? "You're safe? Are you cold? Where are your parents?" But she only stared at him. Bradley suddenly realized she was too young to speak, and that made it even worse. How could a baby end up alone on a highway? Only now in the silence did he hear her breathing. It wasn't steady, as if she wasn't used to breathing deeply, as if each breath was a struggle. He covered her tiny hands with his own. "You'll warm up. It's going to be okay." And at that moment, as her frozen body pressed against him, his mind fractured. A memory from his childhood surged forward. Bradley had been no older than 5. The smell of grilled meat from food stands, people moving like waves, an endless, churning river sweeping him along. His mother had just been there. She had held his hand. But suddenly, she was gone. Where was she? The crowd, the voices, the faces. They were deaf to his panic. They didn't see him. They didn't hear him. The market stretched before him like an endless maze, and he was lost forever inside it. His breath hitched, his chest tightened. The world collapsed. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. It sounded muffled, like it was trapped underwater. Mom, Mama, no one heard. And only then did he realize, I will never see my mother again. The warmth of her hand was gone. Only fear remained. He curled into himself, just like this little girl was doing now, as if making himself smaller would make the emptiness go away. But then someone placed a hand on his shoulder. Hey, kid, you lost? A kind man, a warm touch. That man returned him to his mother. Bradley remembered how his towering rescuer had lifted him onto his shoulders and shouted loud enough for the entire market to hear. Whose kid is this? Everything had gone still. The noise cut off in an instant, and then through the crowd he saw her, his mother, pushing through, tears streaming down her face, never breaking eye contact with him. Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again. He was no longer that child. Now he was the one who saved. The child in his arms, fragile, tiny. He would keep her warm. He wouldn't let go. It's okay, he whispered. And for the first time that night, the girl seemed to relax, trusting the world once more. The police and ambulance hadn't arrived yet. Only the fog remained outside. But now Bradley knew. If he hadn't seen that silhouette on the road, this child would have vanished into it forever. The darkness outside seemed to thicken, growing dense, tangible, like the night itself had come alive. Bradley felt its weight, its cold breath, its silent anticipation. The air was still, and yet he thought he saw movement at the edge of his headlights, a vague, wavering shape, something carefully making its way through the fog, navigating between invisible boundaries. His heart clenched, as if sensing something inevitable. He didn't see her at first. There was only that eerie, sticky feeling, like someone was watching him, that unsettling awareness that something was near, something he didn't yet know but somehow suspected. And then, slowly, like a ghost, she emerged from the darkness. Not from the roadside, not from behind the trees. She simply appeared, as if the night itself had pushed her forward, revealing her only when it was too late to pretend she wasn't there. Bradley held his breath. She stood directly in front of the car, unblinking, unmoving, like a clay doll left on the doorstep of some forgotten house. The headlights cut through the darkness, exposing odd, fragmented details of her appearance. An unbuttoned coat, a woolen hat sitting askew, thin fingers clasped together in front of her chest, and her face. Too many emotions flickered across it at once. Confusion, pain, expectation. But deep within her gaze, something else smoldered. Something that didn't quite belong to human emotions. And that was terrifying. Bradley's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his shoulders tensed. Give her back. The words were quiet. They were neither a request nor a demand. They simply appeared inside his head, as if they hadn't traveled through his ears, but had gone straight to his mind. He flinched. A chill crept over him, despite the heater blowing warm air into the car. The girl in his arms tensed, her tiny fingers clutching his jacket. He felt her sharp nails digging into the fabric, as if she were instinctively trying to hold on. The woman took a step forward. Bradley didn't hear it. His instincts, sharpened by unease, registered only the shift of her shadow beneath her feet, the slow sway of her coat's hem, the way her face slid into the narrow beam of light. Give her back, she repeated, reaching out her hands. She's my granddaughter. Her fingers, they were wrong. Too thin, too dry, like the branches that scrape against windows during stormy nights. Her hands stretched forward too smoothly, too gently, as if they weren't foreign, as if she already knew she would take the child back. Bradley pressed the door lock button. The lock snapped shut with a dull, short click. The woman stopped. Her fingers froze midair, as if they had encountered an invisible barrier. Only now did he truly see her eyes. Deep, dull, empty. They reflected nothing. The headlights' glow simply passed through them, leaving no trace, no glimmer. Then her face began to change. First pitiful, then angry, then lost. Like multiple faces were hidden beneath her skin, none of them truly hers. I only wanted... Her voice trembled, breaking into a whisper. But he told me. Coldness surged through Bradley. Who? Who was she talking about? The woman blinked. For a moment her eyes darkened, not from shadow, not from light, but as if something inside her had moved closer. The light speaks, she whispered. You hear it too, don't you? His heart slammed against his ribs. No, he didn't hear anything. But why, in that instant, did he feel like something was in the darkness behind his car? Why was he suddenly too afraid to turn his head toward the roadside? The woman leaned in again, her hands reaching out. And then everything changed. Her body tensed as if a spasm had run through her from within. Her lips quivered, her face twisted, fear and rage tangled together. What, are you a thief? She suddenly shrieked. A kidnapper? A strange man with a child in the middle of the night? She recoiled, her head snapping up. And at that moment, headlights flared around the bend in the road. A patrol car was approaching. Bradley heard the tires scrape against the wet asphalt. He saw the woman whirl toward the light, her arms outstretched as if seeking protection from the ones coming closer. And then, realization struck him. Everything now depended on who they believed. The patrol car's headlights sliced through the fog, turning it into a dense, swirling veil. Bradley clenched his jaw. He could feel his heart hammering wildly, anxiety swelling, wrapping around him like a cold, sticky wave. He knew what was about to happen. The woman stood in the middle of the road, her coat billowing in the wind, her hat slipping even further, revealing strands of gray hair plastered to her forehead. "Stop him!" she screamed. "He kidnapped a child!" Her voice cut through the night like a wounded, frantic bird. Bradley clenched his fists. The police car came to a quiet stop. Two officers stepped out. One older, broad-shouldered, with a heavy gaze. The other younger, his face cautious, tense. "What's going on here?" The older officer's voice was steady, but tension rippled beneath it. "This man kidnapped my granddaughter." The woman flung out her hands, pointing at Bradley. The younger officer looked at him, then at the child in the car, then back at the woman. Bradley could see them sizing him up. A man in a car, with someone else's child, in the dead of night. He could feel the suspicion in their eyes. "That's not true," he said, his voice firm, but controlled. But the woman wasn't done. "I was following her, searching for her, and he took her." Her voice shook, but it was filled with that strange, painful certainty. The older officer stepped closer. "What's your name?" "Bradley. I was driving on the highway and saw the child crawling on the road. She was alone. I jumped out, grabbed her, put her in the car, and called the police." "Liar!" The woman's voice shot up into a hysterical wail. "I was right behind her. She wandered off from home, and he snatched her. I just want her back." The officers exchanged glances. Their expressions had sharpened. Bradley could feel the tension crackling in the air. Slowly, clearly, he spoke. "Check my phone. My call history. I was the first to call 911. I'm not a kidnapper." The older officer nodded toward the younger one, who stepped forward. "Your ID?" Bradley reached into his pocket. Damn, his hands were sweaty. He wasn't a criminal. He had done nothing wrong. But he felt like he was about to be accused of something terrible. "You understand how this looks?" The older officer's voice was firm now. "I do," Bradley gritted out. "But I found her alone on the highway. She could have frozen to death. She could have been run over." The younger officer turned to the woman. "Can you confirm she's your granddaughter?" "Of course. Of course." She nodded too quickly. Bradley felt an icy fist clench around his throat. And then, realization struck him like a hammer to the skull. The dash cam. "I have footage." The officers turned to him. Now at last their eyes held real interest. "What recording?" "From the dash cam. It recorded everything. You can see that the child was alone on the road." The woman froze. "He's lying!" she shouted. But for the first time, a note of panic crept into her voice. "Show me," the senior officer demanded. Bradley rushed to the car, yanking the flash drive from the dash cam. His hands trembled. What if it hadn't recorded? He handed the drive to the officer. "Can you play it?" The younger officer nodded, pulled out a laptop from the vehicle, and inserted the memory card. Bradley stood motionless, watching as the officer opened the video file. And then, silence. A black screen. The file wouldn't play. A chill ran down Bradley's spine. Damn, he exhaled. The officer narrowed his eyes. The file is corrupted. The woman stirred again. I told you, he's lying. He kidnapped her. The senior officer tensed. Let me see it, he said to his partner. The officer typed a few commands, trying to recover the file. Bradley felt his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. If the video didn't play, if they didn't believe him, if they arrested him, the girl could end up back in this woman's hands. Then suddenly a sound. The screen flickered to life. A desolate road. Darkness. And then, at the edge of the headlights, a tiny figure crawling on the asphalt. Alone. Barefoot. Bradley held his breath. The video clearly showed him stopping, rushing toward her, bending down, and scooping her up in his arms. The woman was nowhere to be seen. The officers froze. The younger one narrowed his eyes. So, where exactly is this granddaughter you were looking for? The woman recoiled, her lips trembling as she stared at the screen. You lied? The senior officer's voice was cold as ice. She turned pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. All right, the senior officer nodded to his partner, who was already reaching for his handcuffs. You are under arrest until we sort this out. The woman gasped, stumbling back, but the officer had already grabbed her wrist. Bradley exhaled slowly. His hands were still shaking. It could have gone differently. If he hadn't remembered the recording, if he hadn't insisted, the girl could have been taken away again, and that thought terrified him more than the cold night. By then, an ambulance had arrived. Paramedics took the girl. Her tiny body seemed almost weightless in the doctor's arms. They worked quickly, efficiently, but there was a glimmer of concern in their eyes. Severely cold but stable. She needs to get to the hospital immediately. They laid her on a stretcher, covered her with a thermal blanket, and secured monitors to her fragile wrists. She didn't resist, didn't cry. But just before the ambulance doors closed, her eyes met Bradley's once more. Large, dark eyes filled with confusion and something else. She looked at him like she was afraid he would disappear. Then the doors slammed shut. The siren wailed and the ambulance sped away. The silence it left behind was deafening. Get in the car. We'll go to the station and make it official. The officer's voice was casual, as if this were just another routine night. But Bradley knew this was far from ordinary. The old woman stood by the police car. Now that it was over, she no longer screamed, no longer fought for the child. She seemed empty, her head tilted slightly, lips moving soundlessly, as if she was still speaking to someone unseen. The officers led her to the patrol car, careful but firm. She didn't resist. Bradley sat in another police vehicle. Only then did he realize how exhausted he was. At the police station, the dim lighting hurt his eyes. The room smelled of old wood, coffee, and paperwork. Bradley sat at a desk, hands clasped, waiting as the officer filled out the report. The old woman was in another room. He could hear her voice through the walls. At first it was a whisper, then fragmented phrases, nonsensical, disturbing. He called her, the light in the dark. I tried to help. It wasn't me. It was him. He told me to. The officers exchanged glances. She's not well, one of them murmured. Call for a psych evaluation, another responded. At that moment, when the officer radioed for a psychiatric team, Bradley's stomach twisted. What if the girl had crawled onto the road just a little later? What if he hadn't seen her? Where would she be now? Bradley clenched his fists. Tell me again. How did you find her? The officer's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Bradley took a deep breath, leaning forward. I was driving. The fog was thick. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I saw it was a child. She was crawling on the asphalt, alone, in pajamas. The officer nodded, taking notes. You stopped immediately? Yes, I ran out, picked her up, put her in my car, and called 911. Then that woman appeared. She claimed the girl was her granddaughter. The officer peered at him over his glasses. And then we arrived. Bradley nodded. You could have hit her, the officer remarked. Bradley closed his eyes, reliving that moment. Yeah, he said quietly. She could have died right there, just meters from the road. But I saw her. A phone rang. The desk officer picked it up. Police department. The voice on the other end was frantic, nearly hysterical. My daughter, she's gone. She was in her crib. Oh my God, she's gone. Bradley's head snapped up. The officer straightened. Your address? The woman on the line sobbed. 13 Matoit Street. We went to bed, and she was just gone. What's your daughter's name? Peggy. Peggy. Silence. The officer met Bradley's gaze. We found your daughter. A choked sob came through the receiver. What? We found her? She was on the road, at night, in pajamas, barefoot. But how? She was in her crib. I put her to bed. She can't walk yet. A sharp intake of breath. Then the woman broke down in tears. When Peggy's parents arrived at the station, they looked like their world had shattered. The mother's eyes were swollen from crying. Her hands gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The father walked with determination, but disbelief was written all over his face. Where is she? Where's our daughter? The officer led them to a separate room, sat them in front of a screen. Before you see her, you need to watch this first. He pressed play. Darkness. A road. Headlights cutting through the night. A small figure crawling on the asphalt. Alone. Barefoot. The mother let out a strangled sob and covered her mouth. The father sat frozen, unblinking, as if his mind refused to accept what he was seeing. The mother buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I don't understand. How? How is this possible? The father still hadn't moved. Bradley inhaled deeply. He knew there would be no answer. But one thing he did know. If he had driven past, that little girl would have vanished into the night. The hospital corridor was long, bathed in yellow artificial light. For Peggy's parents, it felt endless. They nearly ran. The mother stumbled, clutching the wall for support. The father held her hand, gripping it so tightly his fingers turned pale. Here, the nurse said, pushing open the door. And there she was, a tiny figure in a large hospital bed, small hands resting on top of the white blanket. Her face was pale but peaceful. Peggy, the mother collapsed to her knees beside the bed, clutching her daughter's hand, covering it with kisses and tears. You're here. You're here. Peggy blinked, first in confusion, as if she didn't recognize her mother right away, and then her lips trembled as she reached out, squeezing her mother's fingers with her small, still cold hands. Her father didn't say anything. He simply sat beside her, placed a hand on his daughter's back, and closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but from the realization of how close they had been to the edge. Peggy might not have come back, but she was here. She was alive. Her mother kept crying. Her lips trembled. Our guardian angel. Our guardian angel, thank you. Bradley returned home late at night. He thought he'd collapse into bed and pass out instantly. The day had been too long, his body too drained. But the moment he closed his eyes, he saw it all over again. The road, the fog, the tiny figure on the roadside crawling onto the pavement. He saw it again and again, and each time he didn't make it. Each time he drove past, and then suddenly he would wake up with a sharp gasp, as if he had been drowning and finally broke the surface. Outside, the darkness was still, but now he knew how many dangers it held, threats we never even suspect. He looked out the window. No one was there, but why did it feel like someone was? A day later, Peggy was discharged from the hospital. She was still weak, but she was home, safe, warm, and cared for. And then her parents found him. Bradley wasn't even surprised when he saw them at his apartment door. The father shook his hand. Not just in gratitude, but the way you shake the hand of someone you've entrusted with the life of your most precious person. The mother looked pale and exhausted, but in her eyes was the expression of someone who had seen just how thin the line is between hope and loss. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Just, thank you. Bradley nodded, not knowing what to say. Anyone would have done the same, he finally said. No, the father shook his head. Not everyone. You were in the right place. The mother's lips trembled in a faint smile. At the right time, and in her eyes there was still the horror of knowing how easily it could have turned out differently. Bradley invited them inside for a cup of tea. At the table, Peggy's parents shared a story with him. We need to tell you about her grandmother. Bradley tensed. She's sick, the father said, looking away as if searching for the right words. She was diagnosed a long time ago, but we thought it wasn't that serious. The mother ran a trembling hand across her forehead. She would wake up at night. Bradley frowned. For the past few months, we would hear her walking in the hallway. Sometimes she would just stand there, in the dark, listening. Listening? Bradley asked. The mother swallowed hard. She said someone was calling Peggy. A chill ran down Bradley's spine. She heard a voice. The father clenched his fists. She said someone was whispering to her, telling her that Peggy needed to come to the light. The mother let out a quiet sob. But she doesn't remember carrying her out that night. Silence filled the room. She was sure she was helping. Bradley exhaled slowly. She's still in the hospital? Yes, the psychiatric ward. The mother wiped her eyes. Bradley let out a slow breath. In his mind, the scene flashed again. The road, the fog, the small figure on the roadside. What if he hadn't looked that way? What if he had just driven past? And suddenly he realized he would never look at darkness the same way again. From now on, he would always watch it more closely. Bradley stood by the window. The lights turned off. Beyond the glass, the night swayed slowly, deep, unmoving. Darkness hung over the streets like a heavy curtain, seeping into every corner, slipping into empty yards and under old streetlights whose glow barely cut through the gloom. He didn't know why he was standing there again, staring into the endless black. He just couldn't sleep. The same image kept playing in his mind. The road, the fog, the tiny figure on the roadside. If he had blinked at that moment, if his gaze had passed over her, if his thoughts had drifted elsewhere, she could have frozen just a few steps from the road. She could have lain there until the morning frost covered her body. She could have disappeared into the night, or another car speeding down that same highway might not have seen her in time. The driver wouldn't have had a chance to stop. And by morning, the news would report that a child had been found. But no one would know who she was, where she had come from. A little girl who vanished into the night. Bradley closed his eyes. Sometimes saving someone is just a single moment of attention, a single glance into the darkness. He didn't remember when he fell asleep. His body felt heavy, his mind drifting between wakefulness and dreams. Sounds became distant, muffled, as if the world was floating away. Then, a noise. Software almost imperceptible. Bradley's eyes snapped open. The dim glow of the streetlight flickered on the ceiling. He sat up, heart pounding unevenly. What was that? He reached for his phone, unlocked the screen. 2:53 a.m. The exact time he had seen Peggy on the road. His chest tightened. Slowly he got out of bed. His bare feet touched the cold floor, and something inside him tensed, like the air in the room had grown heavier. He walked to the window. Carefully, he pulled back the curtain. Darkness. The yard was empty. Only the faint streetlight blurred the edges of the night. But no one was there. No one. Yet it felt like if he just looked a little harder, if he just listened, he would hear a whisper, words slipping through the cracks of his memory. A voice not from outside, but inside his own mind. You hear it too, don't you? Bradley shuddered. For a second, his breath hitched. But then, he exhaled, forcing the thought away, pushing it out of his mind. Nonsense, just nerves. He let the curtain fall back into place, turned, and walked slowly back to bed. But before he closed his eyes again, before sleep finally took him, one last image surfaced in his mind. A girl, standing in the middle of the road, and something unseen calling her into the night. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. What would you have done in Bradley's place? Would you have stopped in the dead of night for a barely visible silhouette on the road? Or would you have driven past, never realizing you could have saved a life? If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more emotional stories. Share this video with your friends. Maybe it will inspire something important.